Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Adelphi launch ahead of the 2013 Shangri-La Dialogue. I'm Nicholas Redman, I'm the editor of the Adelphi series at IISS. In the past few months we've been fortunate enough to publish not one but two books on themes related to the dialogue, both in plenary sessions and in sideline discussions. And so I took the opportunity to load up the stage this year with not one but two Adelphi authors. Professor Geoffrey is the director of the Corbett Studies Centre at King's College London, doyen of naval historians globally. He wrote a book on Asia's naval expansion, the modernization of fleets, and the question of whether that constituted an arms race. Christian Miere, my colleague, the senior fellow for naval affairs at the IISS, wrote on with our colleague Sarah Rain on the subject of the South China Sea disputes. So I thought it would be an opportunity not only to talk about the books themselves, but also to have a more general discussion about Asian maritime security themes. By a toss of the coin, but also the fact that we apply the family holdback principle, Geoffrey will speak first.
Thanks so much, Nick, and hello everybody. Navies and maritime development in general provide a window through which we can explore the development and policies of the nations they defend. Navies both reflect the strategic environment and play a major role in shaping it, especially in such a maritime area as the Western Pacific. And it is a very maritime place geographically, economically and strategically. As a stock resource, the Western Pacific offers huge quantities of fish, oil and gas to the burgeoning populations of the area, and it helps their transition from being agrarian to being industrial. As a flow resource, it does the same thing by transporting raw materials and manufactured goods to and from other parts of the world, and increasingly around the region itself. This has facilitated a major shift in the world's strategic architecture, the theme of that particular book a few years ago, such that the historic predominance of the Old West is now under substantial challenge. From this maritime perspective, two things of some concern seem to emerge. First of all, alongside the political cooperativeness that comes about through increasing economic interdependence, there are growing tensions about who owns what at sea and what that ownership entitles them to in a great blue swathe that stretches from the waters north of Japan through the East and South China Seas and into the Indian Ocean. This gives you some sort of idea of the constituency of opinion there is in Hainan, in this case, in the fishing industry, for example. Very hard for any government, however democratic, however autocratic, to ignore. These people are under pressure, both from foreign fishing fleets and also from the more industrialized types of fishing craft as well. There are tensions. These people are angry, they're desperate, and that sort of informs the background of many of the maritime disputes of the area. And so this dispute is characterized, if you like, by increasingly frequent bouts of what you might call competitive cartography, lawfare, and other displays of aggressive ownership. These are Coast Guards doing their bit in the islands of the East China Sea. It's hard to believe, secondly, that this is all unconnected with a very significant naval modernization around the region. Whether it's Malaysia's Scorpini submarines, Vietnam's Kilos, India's unprecedented naval building program, or China's new carrier, the Liaoning, and its carrier-killing ballistic missiles, naval modernization across the region is producing, if not always an overall increase in the numbers, then at least substantially more impressive capabilities, both defensive and offensive. If you take the United States out of the equation, in this current decade, Asia is outspending the Old West on navies for the first time in 400 years. Nothing could better illustrate the shifts in the world's strategic architecture than this. So the question is, What are the motives? What is behind all this? What is inspiring this naval modernisation? Is it simply a question of countries with an important maritime dimension naturally developing the kind of forces they need? Now they have the resources with which to do so. Are they just reverting to type after long periods of naval neglect? Is this expansion essentially to be seen as internally motivated, driven by a desire to build up a balanced industrial economy and to reduce strategic dependence on foreign suppliers? Is it simply a question of newly empowered countries taking up their proper place in the world? In Korea, China, and some of the countries of Southeast Asia, we can certainly see emerging naval debates about what balance should be struck between the traditional focus on the near seas and a new interest in more distant ones, and in developing the more ambitious capabilities that go with that. And finally, to what extent is this regional naval development a reaction to the rise of the Chinese Navy and the American rebalance towards Asia, together with its emerging concept of the air sea battle? So is it a new arms race? This is the biggest question of all. Should this naval modernisation be seen as potentially destabilising, developing into some kind of naval arms race that wastes money, exacerbates tensions, and endangers peace? The thinking of the ROK Chernan illustrates the reality and the dangers of this developing situation. So, are we likely to see here in the Asia-Pacific region a replay of the Anglo-German naval rivalry of the period just before the First World War? There are, of course, some major differences between pre-war Europe and the situation now in the Asia-Pacific. Most obviously, if with some exceptions, China, Singapore, India, the countries of the region are devoting a far smaller proportion of their national treasure to defence than did Britain, Germany, and the other countries of pre-war Europe. In general, the rate of technical advance in naval armaments is much slower, with acquisition programs around the area being more incremental, more deliberate, less determined by transformational technology. Technological change now seems much more steady, and the rewards of being ahead, in quotes, more debatable, given the rise of asymmetric technological or political or legal alternatives and strategies. Crucially, few national leaders, diplomats, or even sailors talk in arms race terms as they did then, and certainly do not use the need to get ahead as a justification for their efforts. On the contrary, they make every effort to avoid identifying possible adversaries that they need to build against. Pundits and the enraged netizen might do that, but as a rule, policy makers don't, at least not in public. Nor then was there the kind of compensating, collaborative institutional arrangements that would draw nations together rather than drive them apart. For all its limitations, the Asian way, increasing levels of economic interdependence, and transnational regional structures like ASEAN do limit the habits of competition. Regional navies therefore cooperate against common threats, such as maritime crime in its various forms, piracy, drugs, people smuggling. Witness the success of the Malacca Straits Patrol, for example. They engage in innumerable bilateral, multilateral exercises and operate side by side in dealing with humanitarian and civil disasters, such as the tsunami relief operation in 2004. Little of this was a characteristic of the navies of Europe before the First World War. Nor is the developing architecture anything like as bilateral as it was in Europe in 1914, although there are certainly some hotspots, like the two Koreas. There are cross-cutting effects wherever you look. There seems very little prospect of the region's international relationships degenerating bilaterally into one coalition against another, especially where one is led by China and the other by the US. Most countries not only do not want to choose which of these sides to join, they don't even want the question asked. And this was very different in Europe before the First World War, where there was nothing the weaker sought more than a cast iron security guarantee from a strong protector. But this is not to say that everything in the garden is rosy, for it certainly isn't. What's happening is not a naval arms race at the moment, but it's far from impossible that the naval modernisation process we see around the region could degenerate into one. There are a number of reasons for that. The first, I think, is what you might call the possible clash of natural naval developments. The US Navy's desire, for example, to assure the global access that it thinks it needs, running up against a Chinese desire to defend its own moat, if you like. And I think you could see much the same kind of thing with Vietnam, with other countries in Southeast Asia and Korea as well. And also the balance to be struck between focusing on one's own moat, if you like, and on developing a capacity for more distant or global endeavours. Any day in the disputed East and South China Sea could easily generate an incident that turns a mild competition in risk-taking into a full-blown international crisis at sea. All the countries now investing for the first time in submarines, a demanding and difficult discipline, could well be the victim of an accident. The oil exploration rigs proliferating around the East and South China Seas are likely to, judge by events in more tranquil areas elsewhere, to be the scene of a maritime disaster sooner or later. Any of these issues could be a really difficult issue to handle in maritime areas where ownership is in dispute and nationalist feeling rising. Another problem is the near total lack of transparency about the true extent of individual naval acquisition programs and the intentions that lie behind them, an important distinction. These could well generate worst-case analysis on the part of naval planners all around the region and the reactions that follow. Nor is this much moderated by institutionalised arms control and arms usage procedures. The complete failure to operationalise the 2002 Declaration of Conduct of parties to the South China Sea dispute after over 10 years. The paucity of real working hotline arrangements and incidents at sea agreements all illustrate the problem. And then there is the growth of the social media and the committed netizen, all too ready to give vent to nationalist sentiment over the latest spat in the East and South China Seas, whittling away at their own government's capacity to manoeuvre, and its often already fragile ability to keep control of events. A modern version of the dreadnought fever that gripped Europe before the First World War is not yet evident, but it be a brave analyst looking at the cyber sparring that attended the China-Philippine crisis of last year over the Scarborough Shoal, or the ramming incident that took place earlier in the islands of the East China Sea the year before, who would rule that kind of thing out altogether. For such reasons, sailors and diplomats in the Asia-Pacific region should be continually alert to the risk that today's naval modernisation might just, despite their best intentions, turn into tomorrow's arms race. As a result, the military means might indeed overwhelm the political ends. There are accordingly many who would argue that the short-term imperative, then, is to take as many proactive steps as possible to head this danger off. This means emphasising the common interest to assure good order at sea, and increasing acts of naval togetherness, policy transparency, and more effective ways of reducing operational risk when untoward events occur, as they always will. Thank you.
Geoff, thank you very much. I hope you'll all note that in common with the best think tanks, there's a focus on solutions as much as problems there. While our two speakers swap around, let me also mark your cards to the fact that both of these books, for those who do not yet have a copy, are on sale at the back of the room. So now over to Christian, once he's got his PowerPoint up, on the South China Sea book. This was published 2 or 3 months ago now. It's been launched in London already, but this is the first, this is Christian's first time speaking about the book in Singapore.
Thanks, Nick, and indeed, Geoff. While I largely agree with everything Geoff said on the lack of a naval arms race in the Asia-Pacific, what we're going to do in the second section is zero in on a particular area that demonstrates that there are a series of bilateral or multilateral diplomatic, military and paramilitary competitions that exist within East Asia, and they form a very complex web of competitive dynamics, some which have action-reaction dynamics behind them. The South China Sea is obviously of continuing interest to all of the countries in East Asia, but particularly here in Singapore with the deployment of the USS Freedom this month, the first of the 4 littoral combat ships that will be forward deployed to the island. There's a variety of reasons why I focused on the South China Sea in the book in particular, but also why it's such an important topic at the moment. One is the fact that it's a major maritime thoroughfare, with almost half of the world's merchant fleet tonnage passing through the sea at any one time. Within that shipping will be a large proportion of Northeast Asia's imported oil coming from the Middle East. So it's a vital strategic route for the countries of Northeast Asia, as well as a key economic lifeline for both Northeast and Southeast Asia. It's also a potential source of hydrocarbons, and this map, which is one that we had in the book, shows all of the blocks that have been offered or accepted for concessions in the South China Sea, as well as an area of 9 blocks that were offered by China just off the Vietnamese coast, clearly overlapping with current open blocks, some of which are being exploited by international oil companies. So that demonstrates the clear competition in oil exploration and exploitation already undergoing. Fish is a key major resource, and it's very easy to focus too much on oil and gas for the countries of Southeast Asia, both in terms of protein, but also in terms of the millions of jobs created in the fisheries industries. And it's often fishing boats that are at the heart of disputes that occur on a weekly basis in the South China Sea. But there's also a broader strategic issue within the South China Sea, and that's increasingly focused on China's South Sea Fleet. A major new naval base which has been built on Hainan Island is reflective of the southward shift in China's military geography, and also maybe the base in the future for China's new Type 94 ballistic missile submarines. So to be able to control the South China Sea and use it as a form of a belt of control around the Hainan Island base would allow China to deploy its SSBNs with relative impunity without being concerned about Southeast Asian or even US interference in its deployments. The book is called The South China Sea Disputes because there are actually multiple disputes in the South China Sea and not just one. We try and group them into 4 separate disputes. The Paracel Islands in the northwest, which are disputed by China, Taiwan and Vietnam. The Pratas Islands in the northeast, which are disputed by China and Taiwan and currently occupied by Taiwan. The Spratly Islands in the southeast, which garner most international attention and which are disputed by 6 parties. And Maxwell Bank and Scarborough Reef in the centre of the South China Sea, which are disputed by China, Taiwan and the Philippines, and were the scene of that extended standoff last year. The islands of the Spratly Islands are very close together, and I think this adds to the complexity of the disputes themselves. This map here shows you all of the different deployments within the South China Sea, and in particular the Spratly Islands on that larger map. Some of those islands are within 3 kilometres of each other, so you can actually see an opposing occupation from where you are stood. Many of them are on non-permanent structures and have had to be fortified by concrete or built on stilts because the islands themselves are actually submerged. Vietnam is by far the most active occupant, with 27 occupations in the Spratly Islands. The Philippines has 9 currently. Malaysia has 8, China 7, and Taiwan just 1, but on the largest island. And what we've seen over the past 2 decades, particularly since the Declaration on Conduct, is not the occupation of new features per se, but the continued expansion of current occupations and fortifications on the island, including the building of a variety of airstrips on the islands that exist. Now these are not necessarily large islands, as this picture is meant to demonstrate. This is in fact a Scarborough Shoal, and the Philippines trying to place a Philippine flag there several years ago. The size of the islands is important for a variety of factors. One is international law. Now within UNCLOS, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, it's important to distinguish between islands, rocks, low tide elevations, and just maritime features that don't qualify as any of these. Islands grant the occupier, or the sovereign state, a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, but also a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. So theoretically, if all of the features in the South China Sea were islands, there are millions of square kilometres of exclusive economic zone up for grabs. In reality though, plenty of the features are not islands, they are in fact rocks, which means they are unable to sustain economic life of their own. And this grants them only 12 nautical mile territorial seas and not 200 mile exclusive economic zones. So there's a key difference in what's at stake here, and no country has clarified either their claims specifically, or rather China and Vietnam certainly haven't clarified their claims, but no country has clarified which features qualify as rocks, which is islands, and therefore really what is at stake. And when you see pictures like this, it's unclear why there's so much international attention on the South China Sea at all, and why there's so much competition over what seems to be meaningless rocks. But there are various symbolic factors here at play as well. There's obviously the issues of sovereignty and pride within the Asian states, particularly those Asian states that feel they have been colonized or bullied by larger powers in the past. And there's also the issue of the alliances held by the US within the region, particularly with the Philippines, which necessarily broadens out the dispute into a much more international and strategic one. The US's position is not only over its alliances, but also over its self-perception as the ultimate guarantor of the principle of freedom of navigation. This was directly challenged in 2009 and previously as well, but the most recent case in 2009, when the USNS Impeccable was harried by civilian and military and paramilitary vessels from China. Now, interestingly, China and the US don't necessarily disagree on the ideology of the freedom of navigation per se, or the broad principle. They both rely on maritime trade, and therefore they both want to see sea lines of communication kept open. But they do specifically differ on the details of freedom of navigation, in particular military activities within exclusive economic zones, and it's this the USNS Impeccable ran afoul of in 2009. So the US is seeing itself as trying to make sure it guarantees a freedom of navigation throughout the South China Sea, and using that principle to justify its presence as well. It also has direct economic interests through the coercion of hydrocarbon companies that's occurred over the last few years, particularly since 2006. And in response, we've seen the US rebalance to perceive China's assertiveness both in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and that has seen a greater US diplomatic, economic, and in the future military presence here as well. China has not just been assertive within the paramilitary field, however. It has a very multifaceted approach, particularly to the South China Sea. Diplomatically, it attempts to claim that there is no dispute over many of these islands, and it often uses proxies to reinforce this position. Last year, for instance, Cambodia, as chair of ASEAN, was very effective at trying to remove the South China Sea from various documents and meetings of ASEAN, and that it would be churlish to claim that that wasn't really a policy certainly favoured by China, if not directed by China. There are a variety of military and paramilitary developments within China. Geoff spoke about the rise of the Chinese Navy, but perhaps as important is the development of what were previously 5 maritime constabulary agencies, which are now just 2 agencies, because earlier this year 4 of them were unified under one administrative heading. And those agencies, which have previously been called the 5 Dragons, have been at the forefront of pressing Chinese sovereignty claims within the South China Sea. The aim of the use of these constabulary agencies is to try and change the facts, if not on the ground, then certainly on the water, of the continual presence of Chinese vessels as a form of virtual occupation. China has also understood that it has much greater economic leverage, particularly in Southeast Asia, than it has had before, and has attempted to use this in specific instances. In 2010, it placed a quota on the export of rare earth metal to Japan, and in 2012, it came up with what I think, and I'm not sure, but I think is the only instance in history of coercive banana diplomacy, whereby it prevented the import of a variety of fruits from the Philippines and very effectively placed greater pressure on the Philippine government to back down over the Scarborough Shoal standoff. And finally, China, as with other countries in Southeast Asia, attempts to use administrative diplomacy, whereby it has created bureaucratic and administrative institutions to better regulate what it perceives as its governance in the South China Sea, most famously with the elevation of Sansha to a city level last year, but also by the encouragement of tourism, and we see greater tourist vessels now approaching the Paracel Islands, and through the imposition of a unilateral fishing ban every year. Now, the South China Sea dispute is often framed within the Sino-US competition that we've just been discussing, but in reality, Southeast Asia has a clear role here as well, both in trying to manage the disputes, but also in fueling the disputes in certain instances as well. Southeast Asia, ASEAN, is certainly not united on the way to approach the South China Sea disputes, and within the book we try and clarify them into 4 distinct groups of active ASEAN, which are Vietnam and the Philippines, certainly the most active of the claimants. Askance ASEAN, which include those claimants which are less concerned or less assertive in their claims, such as Malaysia and Brunei. Anxious ASEAN, which are those non-claimants who are anxiously viewing the developments in the South China Sea, such as Singapore and Indonesia and Thailand. And aloof ASEAN, who are those that are less concerned about the South China Sea generally and happy to remove it from international and multilateral agendas, such as Cambodia, but also Laos and Myanmar. Now, those different positions demonstrate there's a very fractious relationship between the ASEAN states over how to approach the South China Sea. This is also underlined by a variety of defence acquisitions throughout the region, including, as Geoff mentioned, submarines being purchased by recently Malaysia, also Singapore, and in the future Vietnam and Indonesia. These are designed to undermine China's growing sea control within the South China Sea, but there are also latent competitions between Southeast Asian states as well, and some of these purchases might be seen as a matter of pride rather than one of military necessity. And finally, Southeast Asian states also are trying to internationalise the disputes by bringing in countries such as the US, but also India and Japan and Russia, to make sure that it remains on international agendas where possible, and also increases the strategic importance of the particular dispute. Now, there are a variety of scenarios that could develop within the South China Sea. We highlight just 4 within the book. These are not mutually exclusive, but they are, I think, very descriptive in their titles. The one that we consider most likely is probably the third one, which is to some extent a continuation of the status quo. Happily, the fourth is probably the least likely, but we don't think it's impossible by any means. It's probably most likely that a conflict would occur by miscalculation rather than by design. The use of paramilitaries as the forward deployment within the South China Sea suggests that these countries are not seeking conflict as a solution to the particular disputes at the moment, but there are always naval forces in the background as well. And finally, because I'm running out of time, I just want to put forward a few policy prescriptions that we believe countries within the Southeast Asian region, but also more broadly, could adopt to try and manage disputes of the South China Sea. And we've categorised them into 4 different areas. One is clarification, not just of the claims, but certainly it's very important for China to clarify its 9-line claim, and also for Vietnam to clarify what it means by the Spratly Islands when it claims all of them, but also of the islands themselves, as we mentioned, which are islands, which are rocks, and which are just maritime features. Collaboration is an area which could see great development and advances, particularly through, for instance, the imposition of a multilateral fishing ban rather than a unilateral fishing ban. More ambitiously, that multilateral fishing ban could be policed by joint or coordinated patrols of the various paramilitary agencies. And an incidents at sea agreement akin to, but certainly not resembling, the US-Soviet INCSI of 1970s would help build confidence between the different parties. The South China Sea dispute will also benefit from a greater contextualization away from the Sino-US military competition and towards one that's focused on international law and regional politics. And finally, a civilianization of the disputes would help to build confidence and reduce tension. And this is not just a demilitarization of the occupations themselves, although that is certainly possible, as Taiwan demonstrated in its Spratly Island in 2000 when the Coast Guard administration assumed control, but also by prioritizing the Ministries of Foreign Affairs through regular meetings to discuss these disputes rather than the Ministries of Defense or, in fact, the People's Liberation Army or other militaries as the main actors behind this. A combination of all these 4 categories of policies, we think, would help build greater confidence and slowly move the trajectory of the South China Sea away from one heading towards conflict to one heading towards some kind of collaborative discussion and hopefully resolution of the various disputes as well. And with that, I think we'll have some time for questions.
Christian, thank you very much. And I would like to open it up 2 questions now. I don't propose to take the first one myself. Do we have a microphone? Is there a microphone? Right. So people are just going to have to speak very loudly. I might request into the microphone if we don't. Firstly, my colleague Alexander Neal, please. I think you just stepped.
All right. Alex Neal, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow. Thank you very much for those fantastic presentations. I have to say, embarrassingly, I haven't read them yet, but I look forward to very soon. Very recently, we've heard the idea of the Indo-Pacific, and we've also heard recently the likes of Pacific Command starting talking about the Indo-Asia Pacific. I don't know whether your work has touched on this, but what do you think are the motives behind pushing this concept? Both of you.
So,
Go first.
yeah, it's an interest. The fashion in changing titles is an interesting reflection of sort of political reality, I sometimes think. When I've used the phrase Asia-Pacific region, I have always included India. And it always seems to me that one of the characteristics of the sea that everybody always needs to remember is that it is all joined up. It's one sea. It's a world ocean, as the Russians call it. But I think there has been a certain sensitivity, not least in the Indian Ocean, to the feeling that the Asia-Pacific region as a label rather undermines or underemphasises the importance of the Indian Ocean. And so the Indo-Pacific label is a kind of reflection of the need to cater for that sensitivity, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's always a desire within policy-making communities to try and lump different problems together to make them easier to either understand or talk about. And I think that's true with this description of the Indo-Pacific, which the Australian Defence White Paper was so clear on describing. And that's because it looks at the maritime disputes of East Asia and the East and South China Seas, but also the problems with sea lines of communication in the Western Indian Ocean as well, as one problem of securing international maritime trade. To some extent, this is fair. It's also, I think, as Geoff said, designed to bring India into the conversation to a greater extent, and to demonstrate to India that it is a key part of this part of the world. Whether that has a beneficial effect in terms of the discussion around the disputes or actually just complicates it, it's unclear. But yeah, I mean, I think all seas are essentially connected. Some of the problems on these seas are similar across all the different oceans and seas. So having something labelled the Indo-Pacific rather than just East Asia is not necessarily intellectually bankrupt, but can actually lend some credence to the idea of the principles rather than the specific disputes themselves.
Thank you. Could I ask, I've got you, if I could ask people very briefly just to state their name as well as their affiliation. Next on my list is Chris Nelson.
Chris Nelson, Nelson reporter, Washington, D.C. Probably the tendency for us in D.C. is to grossly oversimplify. So let me fire away and you can explain why that's just silly. In looking at what we think we're seeing, where the Chinese have, in essence, pinched most of the Philippine fishing grounds as we look at the map, we look at the China-Japan competition from China's standpoint in the Senkaku. Oh, thank you. I'm grossly oversimplifying. We look at what happened as what seems to have happened, China versus the Philippines, where China has established functional control of whatever it wants versus the Philippines, because the Philippines simply doesn't have the naval or paramilitary power to resist that. We look at what may be happening in the Senkakus or Dayo, where China seems to be at a minimum trying to show that Japan does not control it. The question becomes, as you look at this competition, is it oversimplifying to say China's going to keep pushing until they do control the Senkakus, and is that really a risk? Or are they simply are they testing how much Japan is going to push back? How much will the US stand behind Japan if it comes down to that?
Christian first and then over to Jeff, please.
I think I'd say two things to this probably. One is we can categorize the way that China has reacted or acted around these various disputes in various different ways. The International Crisis Group claimed it's a form of reactive assertiveness, whereby, for instance, Vietnam and the Philippines more actively try and exploit hydrocarbons and then China reacts to that. I would call it a form of opportunistic assertiveness, whereby China is often aware that these actions are going to happen and then use them as a justification for their overzealous reactions and assertive reactions as well. Will it continue to push until it essentially controls the islands? I mean, it's impossible to really make that judgment. China has been relatively fair in some of its discussions over territorial disputes in the past, particularly with Russia and also its Central Asian neighbours. So it's not beyond the pale of probability that China will engage in actual discussions on maritime sovereignty on these particular areas. But it is also the case that these are tied up to a much more emotional narrative within China of foreign domination, particularly with Japan. And so it's much more difficult from a domestic political standpoint for China to back down on this issue in any particular way. I don't know what the endgame here will be. I don't know whether there will be negotiation. I don't know whether there will be conflict. I don't think anyone really knows. I think what we will continue to see is China trying to change the facts on the water, trying to build a stronger legal case and adapt the legal environment to its own benefit wherever possible, and continue with its maximalist claims, because they will in the future provide China with a stronger negotiation position. So it could even be that all of this is part of a long-term negotiation strategy whereby China will, in 20 to 30 years, say, now we're ready to sit down because we hold a much stronger position and we continue to claim all of these different waters and we're actually in control of them as well. So let's talk.
Yeah, it's just a very interesting question you asked there. I think it ought to be, trying to answer it, you need to make the point that I think China genuinely believes that it owns both areas, and that its claims to historic title, which long precede UNCLOS deliberations and all the rest of it, are genuinely and widely held. This gives it a bit of a government gives the government a bit of a problem. It's between a rock and a hard place. If it concedes to foreign claimants, or is seen to be weak in defending Chinese, what it's long said to be Chinese property, it appears weak in the face of its nationalistic citizens. If it doesn't, it feeds the perception that China, after all, is a threat. It feeds a sort of a China threat theory, if you like. So it is in a difficult position. It seems to me that this partly explains why in the past there was an emphasis in China on shelving the issue rather than solving it, trying to delay it, in other words, until circumstances change. But I think there's also a second sort of idea or cultural concept in the Chinese reaction, which is broadly translated as, if you kick me once, I'll kick you twice. In other words, if somebody does something, then you can expect a very strong Chinese reaction. And it seems to me that the Scarborough Shoal incident, for example, was interpreted in China as a piece of Philippine adventurers, and particularly the dispatch of a naval ship, and theoretically at any rate. And so their response to it, I think, has been pretty firm and has kind of changed the geography. And that may well lead to the kind of incremental approach that Christian was talking about.
Thank you. The next question is a gentleman here in the aisle in the blue shirt. Microphone's coming your way.
Thank you for your presentations. I'm Ambassador Stephen Chen, representing the National Policy Foundation based in Taipei. I think we in the academic community should pay more attention to the precision of statements. I refer to the statement of reference of Mr. Geoffrey Till, who referred to the ramming incident involving Taiwan and the Philippines. The truth is, it's not a ramming incident. The Philippines indeed said or claimed that it was a ramming incident at first. Now it has stopped saying. In fact, as we speak today here in Singapore, the two sides, Taiwan and the Philippines, are conducting simultaneously parallel investigations. Our team is in the Philippines, and the Philippine team is in Taiwan. Both have ascertained that the two boats, the cutter and our fishing vessel, were at least 50 meters apart. So there's no ramming incident. So the better reference, the better way to put it is fatal shooting incidents. If you don't mind, please stand corrected. Thank you.
Yes, the ramming incident that I was referring to was not that one. The ramming incident was between a Japanese vessel and a Chinese fishing vessel 2 years ago. That incident. I wasn't referring to the incident that you're referring to. It's a different incident.
Although the Taiwanese-Philippine spat is an interesting example of how tensions in different seas can actually start to spill over into the South China Sea, as we've seen a Chinese reaction to the Taiwanese-Philippine issue, and then a Philippine deployment of various gunboats near Second Thomas Shoal, another Philippine-occupied territory, which I think demonstrates that the South China Sea could be used as an outlet for other disagreements that occur between the different claimants as well.
Thank you. Next question, Professor Francois Esbrook, Chairman of the IISS
Very
Council.
Thank you very much.
Francois, just a moment.
The
Microphone.
mic, yeah, thanks. I have the impression that I speak very much under your control, that the level of risk-taking by the contenders is higher in the case of Senkaku Diaoyu than it is in the South China Sea islands. Would you agree with that assessment? And if that assessment is correct, to what would you attribute the higher levels of military risk-taking? I'm talking about military risk-taking, of course. Fire control radars being switched on, ramming of the sort which has just been mentioned. And the companion question is, how would you rate the fire discipline, the rules of engagement discipline of the various contenders? What would be, and I know that diplomatically it may be a difficult question to answer, but what would be, in your view, the weakest link here in terms of a given player cracking under stress, doing something which it would not otherwise normally do?
I think historically, if we look over a broader time span, the greater risk-taking has actually been in the South China Sea, because it's in the South China Sea that we saw actual military clashes in 1974 and 1988. Yes, certainly recently there has been a higher level of bilateral military tension in the East China Sea, but these things often go in waves, if you'll excuse the puns, and levels of tension will increase and decrease according to a variety of endogenous and exogenous factors as well. The reason that we are currently seeing higher levels of tension in the East China Sea, I believe, is partially because there are three disputants, but the two main disputants haven't really reached a tacit agreement about how to conduct themselves in that particular area. So Japan is struggling to draw red lines for where China's activity is clearly unacceptable, and it's unclear how to react, particularly given its specific constitution, where it feels severely constrained by its reactions to it. How that plays out in the long term is unclear, but I think we've already seen a somewhat lessening of the tension just because both sides get used to the fact that China's paramilitary vessels are now there permanently and will continue to be there permanently, and you have daily complaints from the Japanese that this occurs, and it will fall off the headlines and it'll become less an emotional issue domestically. And then 2 or 3 years down the line, we'll probably see an accident or an event happen, and once again it will come back. There are, I would say, around 2012, April 2012 with the Scarborough Shoal, while there was less direct military tension between China and the Philippines, there was plenty of belligerent rhetoric within particularly Chinese state-run newspapers that suggested, for instance, punitive strikes against the Philippine Navy, or the destruction of the Philippine Navy in its entirety. So I think it's difficult to classify exactly where the higher levels of military tension are, and whether they'll be sustained, but I think there's certainly the great possibility of tension in both different theatres. In terms of rules of engagement, I think there's no Navy or no armed forces is immune to accidents, and I think this is particularly true when we're talking about navies or paramilitaries at sea, because there's so much greater remoteness involved and greater autonomy of the commanders at any one time. Obviously the Chinese events do raise very strong questions about the ability of the PLAN to manage any particular incident. But I think things like the introduction of submarines into the region and the fact that some of these countries will be new operators of submarines mean that it's not just the PLAN that may suffer from poor rules of engagement or inability to maintain the correct forms of maritime safety and security. If British and French submarines can bump into each other after almost a century of operations, then new operators who have only had submarines for a few years can certainly cause accidents, and where that leads is a question. But I think this is one of the reasons why Sarah and I in our book have been so keen to stress the idea of an incidents at sea agreement, the opening up of hotlines and other confidence building measures that would help prevent any particular event rapidly escalating beyond anyone's control.
Yes, I think the East China Sea situation is actually potentially more dangerous than South China Sea, because it's inflamed by historic antipathies between the two major claimants. But I agree with what Christian says. These things come in waves, if you like. The issue in the latest incident, and you refer to the fire, the painting with fire control claim that the Japanese made, which has been disputed in at least some Chinese circles as being just an ordinary surveillance radar. We don't know, frankly, at the moment. But it does raise a very interesting issue about the degree of control that governments at home can actually exert over the participants at the front line, as it were, whether they're fishermen, whether they're Coast Guard agencies, or whether they're navies. The picture I showed of all of those Coast Guard vessels wheeling around, spraying water at each other in the East China Sea recently is potentially very dangerous. And what one would really wish to see is the general observance of basic safety at sea regulations of the sort that apply everywhere. But to an extent, the participants in trying to demonstrate the solidity of their claims are willing to take risks there. And it seems very likely that at some stage of the game, somebody will make a serious mistake. And the issue is then what happens, and whether the hotline negotiations, the hotline linkages and so on and so forth, that are slowly being established will actually stand up to the challenge of a fast and effective response to a situation like that. And that's why, and I would second Christian's comment here, it's so important to get these incidents at sea arrangements, not incidents at sea treaties like the ones that were common in the Cold War era, actually solidified in this area.
Thank you very much. Next question is just behind the gentleman from Taipei.
Yeah.
So just there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Viramal Anjaya. I'm from the Jakarta Post from Indonesia. It seems both books are very interesting and timely. I have two questions for two authors. The first one is about the rising defense spending, especially the Naval modernization. But if we see the numbers, though the defense spending has been growing for several years, but if we see, for example, last year, only the East Asia constitutes only $300 billion out of $1.75 trillion. So it is a very small amount. Even if you see the naval spending in Japan, which is the third biggest economy in the world, it is just only $10 billion. My question is, these modernization really reached at an alarm level, or like for example in case of my country Indonesia, we don't have a minimum requirement to safeguard the vast coast. It will take at least 4 or 5 years to have a minimum patrols, to safeguard our own territories. So it is the same case in India, same case in China, which has vast coast. But my question is, this modernization, I mean, may or may not lead to a war or not, because recently, I mean, in Asian countries, the economies are growing at a faster rate than the Europe and the US. But these economic benefits, all countries see. I mean, are they foolish to have a war? I mean, in these disputes, because we are not living in the 20th century, like where, I mean, European wars, in, I mean, even Indochina war, I mean, you know. I mean, there was a very clear indication from China. It is very interesting. Just recently, when the Chinese Prime Minister visited India, both countries agreed the land disputes, border disputes should not undermine the bilateral relations, and I mean, especially the economic relations. If that same principle applicable to the South China Sea is maybe very interesting. That is my question, first question. And the second one is, now countries are occupying so many islands, rocks, whatever you call it in South China Sea. But we had an example. Several years back, we had a dispute between Malaysia and Indonesia over two islands, Sipadan and Ligitan Islands. Both went to the International Court of Justice. There, the court decided that both countries' legal claims were not valid, so they came to a conclusion that which country currently occupying those islands, so they gave their decision in favor of those countries. Maybe that may be the motivation, because why these countries are aggressively occupying the islands. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question, the one that was directed at me. You're right. It seems to me that, broadly speaking, levels of expenditure on navies within the Asia-Pacific region are not, by historic standards, excessive. In most cases, the proportion of GDP spent on defence is historically low. It's 2%-ish. The fact, of course, that the GDPs of most countries in this region are growing, nonetheless means that increasing actual money is being spent, if you like. But in many cases, this is repairing long periods of neglect. You refer to your own country, Indonesia. I would also refer to the Philippines, both archipelagic countries with large numbers of islands, big areas of sea to monitor, and so on and so forth, which many outside observers would have been surprised about the relatively low importance that apparently attached by the Indonesian and Philippine regimes in the past to the protection of those sorts of assets. And what we slowly see happening, you can argue, is a recognition at governmental level of the importance of the maritime element of their economies and the maritime nature of their states, and therefore taking appropriate action there they can afford to do so. So that basic point, I think, is true, and it's an important one that distinguishes the situation here broadly from the situation that applied in Europe before the First World War, where, after all, something like half of government expenditure was devoted to defence.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I think defence spending and the rapidity of purchases is nowhere near the characterisation of an arms race, but there are forms of competition. I mean, you mentioned that we should feel fortunate we don't live in the 20th century, which obviously was the time of devastating wars in a variety of different theatres, but those living in the early 20th century probably felt fortunate they weren't living in the early 19th century when the Napoleonic Wars ravaged most of Europe. So we should be careful about being too complacent about the period in which we find ourselves, and also the dynamics of military competition in any particular area. On the issue of occupation for occupation's sake, yes, it's undoubtable that the countries are or have in the past been very keen to occupy the various islands because it strengthens their legal position, it gives them an ability to try and influence the facts on the ground, as it were, and it allows them to be more directly involved in discussion and to strengthen their negotiation position for the future. The issue of Sipadan, Ligitan is not really relevant to the South China Sea because there's simply no way at the moment there'll be any kind of international legal arbitration. And we see that with the Philippines' attempt to open an arbitral tribunal being simply rejected by China, which has already opted out of the various articles and UNCLOS that would force or compel any particular UNCLOS participant to participate in the 4 separate kinds of dispute resolution that exist. So there are various examples in Southeast Asia of international legal arbitration having come to successful and largely acceptable conclusions for the parties involved, but it's not really very likely currently in the South China Sea.
Thank you. We have only a little time left and I still have 5 names on the list. So what I propose to do now is to take questions in bunches of 2s. Nick Bisley, please.
Thank you. Nick Bisley from La Trobe University in Australia. Question really for Christian. I think the book, but both you and Sarah make the point that the complexity of the South China Sea has kind of got these layers. You've got the strategic, you've got the material, the resources and the like, and then you've got the identity. And I think it's the 3 of them interlocking that makes this particularly problematic, and particularly that bottom one. I think it's really about identity. It's not just sovereignty, but for a lot of these countries, this is a crucial, kind of indivisible proposition. I was wondering if you might give some thoughts as to, given how important this is to the identity not only of China, but Vietnam, Philippines, other countries, this is a pretty hard to reconcile with some sort of non-zero sum thinking. So how does one introduce forms of compromise when you've got such an important kind of identity bedrock underlying the problem?
Let's just hang a sec. And then a gentleman, I think it's an air conditioning controlled by you. Thank you.
Jin Huang and from Lee School of Public Policy. And we know that there are tensions in South China Sea and East China Sea. We also know that there's always a possibility accident can happen. Someone will fire first shot for whatever reason. And in your presentation, I'd like to ask a question about, do you think about escalation control? That is, how to prevent a little accident escalating into a major confrontations, because do you think that international community has such capability mechanism to do so, or do you think the involved parties like China and major will have willingness and capability to do so, that the little accident will not get into confrontation?
Thank you. Could you just pass the microphone to the gentleman behind you? Go from 2 to 3.
Yeah, I'm Rommel from the Philippines. I will not comment on Taiwan. We're friends. We're both democracies. Democracies do not go to war. Since you mentioned about international arbitration, and China remains to ignore the process. If we lose, then that's the end. We'll honor the decision of the international community, and China can do whatever it wants in the area. But if we win, we don't have a way to enforce it, because we don't have the capability to enforce it. We don't have a way to guard our very big archipelago. And we still have to negotiate with China bilaterally and beg China to enforce it. So what will the international community do? And do you think we're doing the wise thing? Because if we win, then it will have huge implications for other claimants. Vietnam will be affected because next to China, Vietnam is also excessive in its claim in the South China Sea. So it's a dreadful situation for the Philippines. So what is your comment on that?
Jeff first.
Yeah, 3 very varied questions. Oops, 3 very varied questions. First of all, I would reiterate the point that for many countries, for many governments, I'm going back to this issue of identity. The ability to protect islands is a kind of performance indicator of how well the government is doing in the eyes of increasingly nationalistic citizenry. And this becomes something that is extremely difficult for governments to get out of. Once they are taught in primary schools upwards that those particular specks on the map are actually Chinese or Argentine or whatever it is, it becomes very difficult for them to sort of backtrack on that. The one option is to go the Philippine route, is to go to arbitration, and then to be able to say, well, we thought they were ours, but apparently the world community thinks they're not by international law, and then there we are. That provides, if you like, a kind of possibility of an honourable retreat, maybe. On this business of escalation control, this strikes me as being really important. And I was trying to make the distinction in my last answer between incidents at sea agreement of the sort that were characteristic of the Cold War and the full observance of standard rules of the road as far as shipping and warships are concerned, which simply means you avoid situations that endanger life and are common to warships, to merchant ships, and so on and so forth. And there really is a need to try to establish a system by which, if something happens, as it undoubtedly will, then when you lift up the phone to talk on the hotline, there is somebody at the other end who is actually in a position to answer. And this seems to me to be highly debatable at the moment. We're not in that position, and it seems to me that we should be. And one of the reasons why we're not in that situation is that some countries regard negotiations about the establishment of a hotline as an end in itself, rather than a means to an end. In other words, if the person you're negotiating with does something that irritates you, then you stop negotiating, which is actually, paradoxically, the reverse of what you should be doing. The third point I would make is that, and it's connected to that really, is that there is a possibility, if you like, of kind of internal dynamics making a situation worse. Again, that picture I showed of Coast Guard vessels sort of squabbling with each other, where there is confusion between the various stakeholders in maintaining maritime security, where there's budgetary rivalry, where there's various Coast Guard agencies competing against each other to show that they're better protectors of established islets and that sort of thing. That seems to me to be potentially dangerous. So in common with many people, I rather welcome the reform of Coast Guard agencies that's taking place all around the region actually, not least in China. Because it seems to me to be moving towards a more structured sort of policy towards the protection of what their claims are.
Yeah, on the issue of identity, Nick, I think it's a very important point to draw out, the idea of Asian nationalism and how that will affect negotiation positions. But I don't think that nationalism is per se antithetical to the idea of compromise in any way. And I would draw attention to, and I wish I'd thought of this before I'd written the book, draw attention to the Treaty of Spitsbergen in, I think it was 1921, when a variety of European states and then other states came up with a very suitable compromise over the sovereignty of Svalbard. And this is in the era of imperial countries at the height of nationalism in Europe. And they decided that Svalbard would remain under Norwegian sovereignty, but that every participant, every signatory, would have the right to peaceful use of Svalbard territory for science and for a variety of other activities, and also joint fishing rights in the waters around Svalbard. And that is an excellent example that could be mirrored in the South China Sea, and in fact that Taiwan has attempted to mirror to some extent in its joint fishing agreement with Japan in the East China Sea. So Asian nationalism is a dangerous beast in that it could force countries down roads they don't want to go down, but it's not impossible to contemplate compromise solutions that could be found, and have already been found in the South China Sea previously through, for instance, a joint marine seismic undertaking, which, although very temporary and ultimately failed, was a sign that countries can reach these compromises if they really try. So very briefly on the two other questions, on the issue of escalation control, I think countries are already engaging in escalation control by their use of paramilitary agencies rather than militaries. The deployment of unarmed ships is meant to be a self-controlling deployment. You can't, or you find it much more difficult to kill people if you don't have guns on board than if you send a frigate bristling with missiles. There's a variety of other reasons to do it anyway, but that's one particular issue behind it. And on the arbitral tribunal, it's true that it's impossible for the Philippines to enforce the tribunal, but I think it's a very smart diplomatic move to bring the tribunal in the first place, because it embarrasses China. It changes the narrative from one of competition to one of legal dispute, one of paramilitary competition to one of legal dispute. And the Philippines' best strategy in the future, should it win, will be to continue to try and embarrass China into following the tribunal's recommendations in the future, because China has signed up to the DOC, which states that all parties will try and resolve these disputes through negotiation and under UNCLOS, and is seeking to theoretically sign a code of conduct that would solidify the same.
Thank you. We are now into added time, so I'll ask both of our questioners to be brief. Firstly, gentleman here, please. Second row.
very briefly, Kaufmann from Swiss newspaper NZZ. Christian, you mentioned it's not an arm race, but it's competitive. Where exactly do you make the difference? And a question to you: the Philippines, for example, as it is upgrading its navy, what could the target really be? Because if it gets serious, they will ever rely on the US, won't they? They will never be able to challenge the Chinese if it gets serious. So what is a reasonable target of such an upgrading of the Navy?
And finally, the lady in the third row, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Chikago Weki, professor at Waseda University, Japan. I have two questions. One is to do with the internationalization, the consequences of internationalization of the issue, and the second one, a cost of compromise. The first one, obviously the parties involved are internationalizing the issue for a certain objectives. And my question is, do you think it's having a positive impact on the behavior of Chinese? I'm sure the others are sort of trying to connect the different disputes in order to pressure China, but I'm wondering whether it's having a positive effect or not on changing the Chinese behavior to somewhat more or is it totally independent? Second question is to do with the cost of compromise. Obviously, the cost of a non-compromise is a possible greater risk of conflict. But do you see any dangers of compromising in the view of certain parties, for example, China, being more assertive? And if a compromise is made, that might signal success of pushing, and that might signal sort of a different behavior the second time around, or maybe would make the Chinese government even more difficult to compromise in the view of the emotional nation. Thank you.
Again, some interestingly varied questions. What's the difference between a naval arms race and naval competition? I think basically speaking, the difference is if it destabilizes political relationships. Competition doesn't. Competition is something that is kind of expected in a realist world, a view of the world, if you like. It only becomes dangerous when it starts to actually become not simply a means of policy, but something that shapes policy. And that's what the naval arms race in Europe before the First World War did. It actually affected what foreign policy makers actually decided to do, rather than simply using naval developments, if you like, as an instrument by which they could pursue their policies. So I think the difference is pretty important. And I do not think we're at the stage where we are seeing naval modernization reaching the stage where it could destabilize the situation now. My point is that we can't rule that out for the future. The second question you asked was about what's the point of the Philippines or any other, presumably, of the smaller claimants for the South China Sea getting into naval modernization, bearing in mind the great superiority of their major rival claimant, China. I think one of the thoughts that may be in the back of naval planners in places like Manila and Hanoi is that they know full well that China is actually principally focused on the United States. And therefore, it's what they have to deal with, if you like, is a kind of isolated element of the Chinese overall priority list. And that makes, that may be effective in the sense of actually relatively small forces actually having an impact. I'm not talking about a military impact, I'm talking about a political impact. In other words, in order for you to actually take arbiter, what we consider to be arbiter of the South China Sea, you might have to engage with one of our naval ships, and that's a whole different ballgame from actually simply scaring off some of our fishing boats. That seems to me to be about the limit of it, because they're perfectly aware that in terms of the military correlation of forces, as you were, there's no hope, if you like, of winning their case by that. The question about internationalization, I think, is an interesting one. It does seem to me that it's a dangerous game. Getting outside countries involved, outside in quotes, as far as Beijing is concerned, is a potentially dangerous thing. in the sense that it might be counterproductive. It might increase the sense of China's sense, if you like, of being kind of surrounded by potentially hostile and competitive powers. So, and it might encourage harder line people, if you like, in China to think, well, we can actually use the Senkaku Islands dispute, for example, as a way of testing just how important the relationship between Japan and the United States, or the Philippines and the United States actually is in America's eyes. So it's inevitable. This is an international incident, international affair, whether Beijing likes it or not, because the sea is all joined up. Because the precedents that are established here will apply everywhere, for all of those reasons. But it's not, it's a double-edged sword, and it could be as dangerous as it's helpful to the local claimants.
Thank you. On the question of arms race versus competition, I mentioned the fact of military competition because there does seem to be clear bilateral dynamics here and often action-reaction dynamics. China develops its surface fleet, Vietnam buys 6-kilo submarines, China develops a Type 56 corvette. But the difference between that and a full-blown arms race is that the action-reaction dynamics we're seeing are not uncontrollable. Arms races have a self-reinforcing dynamic that means they soon spiral out of the control of anyone involved. The UK and Germany don't want to be building dreadnoughts, but feel that they must because they fear and suspect that the other side will do so and they will lose out. I would recommend this book by Professor Geoffrey Till, on page 19 of which he lists 7 different aspects that are used to characterise arms races, of which action-reaction dynamics is just one. Geoff also mentioned the rapidity of purchases, which is currently lacking from the idea of an arms race in East Asia as well, but there are a variety of other issues as well that don't seem to fit the description currently of an arms race. That doesn't mean we won't get there in the future. It doesn't mean we're not seeing the nascent development of an arms race now. And we see more rapid defence purchases in Indonesia and the Philippines, for instance. But certainly at this current moment, I think it's premature to call what we see in East Asia an arms race. On the issue of internationalisation, I don't think it's having a positive impact on China's policy. I think it's having a positive impact on the perception within Southeast Asian countries of their negotiation position, but I think China feels more contained by the US rebalance, more fearful of the US presence, and slightly resentful of the internationalisation of the dispute. In terms of compromise and assertiveness, compromise is not necessarily seen as a reward for assertive behaviour if there is mutual compromise involved. The Scarborough Shoal issue was not a compromise, it was a defeat for the Philippines. And that's why we think, or I personally think, it will lead to further assertiveness by China because essentially its tactic worked. But if you have a situation where both sides agree to compromise in whatever format that might be, then there's no reason why that would be seen as a reward for assertive behaviour or encouraging further assertiveness in the future. So the key is being able to negotiate a compromise that's seen as mutual rather than very one-sided.
Thank you. I'll bring our session to a close there, although I sense there is appetite for more. I wanted to thank you all very much for coming. I hope you found this session useful. I hope it's given you food for thought and sharpened your ideas to put to the plenary speakers over the next couple of days. So thank you all for your questions, with the one exception of Nick Bisley, who has my awful thinking about a second edition. I'll deal with you later. And join me please in thanking our speakers.